October 25th, 1944, 6:37 hours. 40 miles east of Samar Island, Philippines. Rear Admiral Clifton A.F. Sprague, 53 years old, from Dorchester, Massachusetts, was drinking his second cup of coffee in the flag plot aboard USS Fanshawe Bay when the radio crackled with words that would define the next 3 hours of his life. Air plot reports contacts, bearing 340, distance 20 miles. Estimate composition. For battleships, 8 cruisers, destroyers. Sprague's coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. His staff officers looked at each other, waiting for someone to say the obvious, that the report had to be wrong, that Japanese battleships couldn't possibly be here, that Admiral William Halsey's Third Fleet was supposed to be guarding the northern approaches. But the radar didn't lie. And when the lookouts on Fanshawe Bay's bridge began reporting pagoda masts on the horizon, the distinctive superstructures of Japanese battleships that looked like Buddhist temples stacked on warships, Sprague understood with perfect, terrible clarity that a small escort carrier group was facing the most powerful surface fleet Japan could still field. Task Unit April 3rd, 77, call sign Taffy 3, consisted of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. They were designed to provide air support for ground troops and hunt submarines, not fight battleships. Their carriers were converted merchant hulls nicknamed Jeep carriers, or, less charitably, combustible, vulnerable, and expendable. Their destroyers carried 5-inch guns that would bounce off battleship armor like thrown pebbles. And charging toward them at 25 knots was Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, the battleships Yamato, Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers, the largest concentration of Japanese naval power remaining after 3 years of brutal Pacific warfare. The mathematics of the engagement were simple and hopeless. Taffy 3 displaced roughly 100,000 tons total. Center force displaced over 300,000 tons. Yamato alone, the largest battleship ever built, outweighed all 6 American escort carriers combined. Her 18.1-inch main guns could fire 3,200-pound shells 26 miles. The escort carrier's defensive armament consisted of single 5-inch guns that might as well have been throwing spitballs. Sprague had perhaps 15 minutes before those massive guns found their range and began systematically destroying his carriers one by one. What happened next would become known as the Battle off Samar, the most lopsided naval engagement in American history, and one of the greatest displays of courage under fire ever recorded. In the span of 3 hours, 13 American warships would face 23 Japanese ships in a running gun battle that should have ended in complete annihilation. Instead, it ended in one of the most improbable victories of World War II, bought with blood, audacity, and the absolute refusal of men who knew they were about to perish to die without making the enemy pay an impossible price. This is the story of how tin cans fought battleships, how escort carriers faced cruisers, how men in ships they knew were condemned continued fighting long after any rational hope of survival had vanished, and how the Japanese, on the verge of their greatest naval victory, turned away from what they thought was a trap, but was actually just desperate American sailors making them believe in ghosts. Commander Ernest Edwin Evans, 36 years old, from Pawnee, Oklahoma, commanding USS Johnston, understood within seconds of receiving the contact report that his destroyer was about to die. The question wasn't whether Johnston would survive. The question was what she would accomplish before she sank. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, was actually 4 separate engagements happening simultaneously across hundreds of miles of Philippine waters. The Japanese plan, Operation Shogo Victory, was a desperate gambit to destroy the American invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf using every operational warship Japan still possessed. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Vice Admiral Ozawa's Northern Force, consisting of Japan's 4 remaining aircraft carriers with almost no aircraft aboard, would act as bait, luring Admiral William Halsey's powerful Third Fleet away from Leyte Gulf. With Halsey gone, 2 Japanese surface forces would converge on the invasion beaches from different directions. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura's Southern Force through Surigao Strait, and Kurita's Center Force through San Bernardino Strait. The plan was working perfectly. On the night of October 24th to 25th, Nishimura's Southern Force had been annihilated in Surigao Strait by American battleships in the last battleship versus battleship engagement in history. But Nishimura's sacrifice bought time for Kurita's much more powerful center force to transit San Bernardino Strait unopposed. Halsey had taken the bait. The Third Fleet's massive battleships and fleet carriers were 300 miles north, chasing Ozawa's decoy force. The only thing standing between Kurita's battleships and the vulnerable invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf were 3 small escort carrier groups providing air support and anti-submarine protection. Taffy 1 was operating south of Leyte. Taffy 2 was off the eastern coast. And Taffy 3, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague's unit, was steaming in a rectangular pattern 40 miles east of Samar Island, launching and recovering aircraft for ground support missions. At 6:37 hours on October 25th, when the radar operator aboard Fanshawe Bay reported contacts to the north, Sprague's first thought was that the contacts were part of Taffy 2, slightly off station. His second thought, when the bearing and range continued closing, was that perhaps it was a friendly surface force he hadn't been informed about. Communications in the Philippines campaign were often chaotic. His third thought, when lookouts reported pagoda masts on the horizon, was unprintable. All ships, this is Iggy. Sprague transmitted on the TBS talk between ships, radio at 6:58 hours. His voice was calm, almost conversational, as if he were discussing the weather rather than imminent annihilation. We are being gauged by a large Japanese surface force. We will head east at flank speed and make smoke. Prepare to launch all available aircraft. Small boys stand by for orders. Small boys was Navy slang for destroyers and destroyer escorts, the screening vessels protecting the carriers. Aboard USS Johnston, Commander Ernest Evans received Sprague's transmission while standing on his bridge wing. Binoculars trained on the pagoda masts now clearly visible to the northwest. Evans was a member of the Cherokee and Creek Nations, a Naval Academy graduate from the class of 1931, and a man whose commissioning speech to his crew when he took command of Johnston in 1943 had been blunt. This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now. No one had gotten off. Now, watching battleship masts close at 25 knots, Evans turned to his executive officer, Lieutenant Robert C. Hagan, 28 years old from Chicago, Illinois, and said quietly, "Looks like we're going to have to fight our way out of this one." Then, without waiting for orders from Admiral Sprague, Evans gave command that would define the battle off Samar. All ahead flank, left full rudder, prepare for surface action. Johnston broke formation and charged directly toward the Japanese fleet. At 7 o'clock hours, Johnston was 18,000 yards from the nearest Japanese cruiser, far inside the range where 5.5 inch/38 caliber guns could be effective, but still outside the range where her 10-21-inch torpedo tubes could reach. Evans was about to change that. The destroyer accelerated to 35 knots, generating a massive bow wave as she cut to the calm Philippine Sea. Her crew of 327 men went to general quarters with practiced efficiency. In the forward fire director, Lieutenant Robert Billy, 25 years old from Texas, began calculating firing solutions against targets that outweighed his ship by a factor of 10. At 7:10 hours, Johnston opened fire. The 5-inch guns could fire 15 rounds per minute at maximum rate. They began walking shells toward the Japanese cruiser Kumano, flagship of Cruiser Division 7. The shells were relatively small, 54 pounds each, compared to the 3,200-pound monsters that Yamato could throw, but they were accurate, and at closing range, they found targets. One shell struck Kumano's superstructure. Another hit near her bridge. They caused minimal damage. Kumano was designed to withstand far heavier punishment, but they achieved something more important. They got Kurita's attention. At 7:15 hours, Johnston reached torpedo range, 10,000 yards. Fire torpedoes, Evans ordered. 10 21-inch Mark 15 torpedoes launched from Johnston's tubes in rapid succession, each carrying 825 pounds of Torpex explosive. They churned through the water at 46 knots, leaving distinctive wakes that Evans couldn't hide even if he wanted to. For 3 minutes and 20 seconds, the torpedoes ran hot, straight, and normal toward Kumano. The Japanese cruiser, her captain spotting the wakes, attempted to maneuver. At 28,000 tons and capable of 35 knots, Kumano was fast and agile for a heavy cruiser. She wasn't fast enough. At 7:18 hours, one of Johnston's torpedoes struck Kumano near her bow. The explosion tore away 40 feet of the cruiser's forward section. A second torpedo hit amidships, flooding 2 engine rooms. Kumano slewed hard to starboard, slowing rapidly as water poured into her hull. Cruiser Division 7's flagship, one of the most powerful warships in Kurita's formation, had just been crippled by a single destroyer that massed less than 1/10 her displacement. Evans ordered Johnston to reverse course and lay smoke. The destroyer generated a thick chemical smokescreen as she fled east at maximum speed. Behind her, Kumano limped out of formation, taking on water and listing to port. She would survive the day, but would play no further role in the battle. Admiral Kurita, watching from Yamato's bridge, saw a single American destroyer charge into point-blank range, cripple one of his heavy cruisers, and escape into smoke. His first tactical assessment of the battle was beginning to form. The Americans were far more aggressive than intelligence had suggested. This would not be the easy victory he had anticipated. At 7:20 hours, as Johnston disappeared into her own smoke, Admiral Sprague issued the order that would send the rest of the destroyers and destroyer escorts into action. Small boys attack. He was ordering tin cans to fight battleships. He knew it was suicide. He also knew it was the only way to buy time for his carriers to escape. The men aboard USS Hull, USS Heermann, USS Samuel B. Roberts, USS Dennis, USS John C. Butler, USS Raymond, and USS Johnston understood perfectly well that they were being sent to their deaths. They also understood that 6 escort carriers, carrying thousands of sailors and aviators, depended on them making that sacrifice count. Not one man protested. Not one ship turned away. At 7:25 hours, the 7 small boys of Taffy 3 charged toward 23 Japanese warships in what would become known as the Charge of the Tin Cans, one of the most one-sided and heroic naval actions in military history. USS Hull, commanded by Commander Leon S. Kintberger, 40 years old, from Chicago, Illinois, was the first destroyer to follow Johnston's lead. At 7:28 hours, Hull emerged from the smokescreen and increased speed to 30 knots, her crew going to general quarters as she oriented toward the Japanese formation. Kintberger's orders were simple: make a torpedo attack on the lead battleship. The lead battleship was Congo, a 31,000-ton fast battleship capable of 30 knots, armed with 8 14-inch guns, and protected by armor that could withstand direct hits from cruiser-caliber weapons. Hull displaced 2,100 tons, carried 5 5-inch guns, and had armor plating measured in fractions of an inch. The engagement should have lasted seconds. Instead, it lasted nearly 2 hours. At 7:30 hours, Hull launched 5 torpedoes at Congo from 9,000 yards. The battleship maneuvered to avoid, her captain having watched what Johnston had done to Kumano and taken the torpedo threat seriously. All 5 torpedoes missed, but Congo's evasive maneuvers took her temporarily out of formation and delayed her ability to engage the escort carriers. Hull turned hard to port to bring her remaining torpedo tubes to bear, exposing her port side to the entire Japanese formation in the process. At 7:32 hours, she took her first hit, an 8-inch shell from the heavy cruiser Haguro that struck amidships, destroying one engine room and reducing her speed to 17 knots. Commander Kintberger ordered the remaining 5 torpedoes fired at Haguro from 6,000 yards, danger-close range where a hit was almost guaranteed, but where enemy return fire would be devastating. 3 torpedoes launched successfully. The other 2 tubes had been damaged by the shell hit and wouldn't fire. 1 torpedo struck Haguro below the waterline, flooding 2 compartments and reducing her speed. The heavy cruiser fell back, her damage control teams fighting to keep her operational. 2 Japanese cruisers crippled in the first 15 minutes of the battle, both by destroyers that had no business surviving against such targets. But Hull's luck was running out. At 7:40 hours, she took a direct hit from a 14-inch shell fired by the battleship Haruna from 18,000 yards. The massive projectile, weighing 1,400 pounds, struck Hull's forward section and detonated inside the hull. The explosion destroyed the forward fire director, killed 40 men instantly, and started fires that spread rapidly through the destroyer's wooden deck planking. Hull slowed further, her speed dropping to 11 knots. She was dead in the water relative to the Japanese formation, closing at 25 knots. Commander Kintberger knew his ship had minutes, perhaps seconds, before she was overwhelmed. He ordered his gun crews to continue firing manually, without the benefit of the destroyed fire director. At 7:45 hours, Hull's remaining guns were engaging targets at point-blank range, under 10,000 yards, hitting cruisers and battleships with 5-inch shells that caused minor damage, but proved the Americans were still fighting. At 7:50 hours, Hull took another 14-inch hit, this time from Congo. The shell struck the bridge, killing Commander Kintberger and most of the senior officers. Lieutenant Commander William D. Thomas, Hull's executive officer, 34 years old, from Pennsylvania, assumed command of a ship that was already sinking. Thomas ordered the crew to abandon ship at 8:30 hours. By then, Hull had taken over 40 hits from battleship, cruiser, and destroyer fire. Her forward section was destroyed. Her engineering spaces were flooded. Her stern was rising out of the water as the bow settled toward the ocean floor 4,000 fathoms below. At 8:55 hours, USS Hull capsized and sank. Of her 330-man crew, 253 went into the water. Only 86 would survive. But in her final 90 minutes of life, Hull had accomplished what no one thought possible. She had delayed the Japanese advance, damaged 2 enemy cruisers, and forced multiple battleships to maneuver defensively rather than firing on the escort carriers. While Hull was fighting her death battle, the other destroyers and destroyer escorts were pressing their own attacks. USS Hirman, commanded by Commander Amos T. Hathaway, 38 years old from Massachusetts, executed what naval historians would later call the most aggressive destroyer action of the Pacific War. At 7:54 hours, Hirman charged directly at the battleship Haruna, closing to 4,400 yards, a range where Haruna's 14-inch guns couldn't depress low enough to hit the small destroyer, but where Hirman's torpedoes were guaranteed to reach their target. Hirman launched 7 torpedoes in a spread pattern from 4,400 yards, then executed a hard turn to port that brought her within 2,000 yards of Haruna, so close that sailors on both ships could see each other clearly. The battleship's secondary battery opened fire with 6-inch guns, but Hirman was already inside the minimum engagement range, weaving between shell splashes at 32 knots. One of Hirman's torpedoes struck Haruna midships, causing moderate flooding. More importantly, the battleship turned away from the torpedo spread, breaking formation and temporarily removing her massive firepower from the engagement. Hirman survived her suicidal charge with only minor damage, a near miracle that Commander Hathaway attributed to pure luck and the grace of God. But the most improbable attack of the entire battle came from USS Samuel B. Roberts, a destroyer escort that displaced only 1,350 tons and was never designed to fight surface targets larger than submarines. Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland, 33 years old from Tacoma, Washington, received the order to attack at 7:50 hours. He looked at his executive officer, Lieutenant Robert C. Burton, and said flatly, "We're not coming back from this one." Then he increased speed to maximum, 24 knots, slow by destroyer standards, and pointed Samuel B. Roberts bowed toward the Japanese heavy cruiser Chokai. USS Samuel B. Roberts was not supposed to be a warship in the traditional sense. Destroyer escorts, Ds in Navy parlance, were designed for convoy protection and anti-submarine warfare. They were built quickly, cheaply, and in massive numbers. Their armament reflected their intended role. 2 5-inch guns, compared to 5 on destroyer, 3 21-inch torpedo tubes, compared to 10 on destroyer, and depth charges for hunting submarines. They were absolutely not designed to engage heavy cruisers in surface combat. Lieutenant Commander Copeland didn't care about design specifications. He cared about buying time for the escort carriers, and that meant putting Samuel B. Roberts between the Japanese cruisers and their targets. At 8:05 hours, Samuel B. Roberts engaged Chokai from 10,000 yards with her 4 5-inch gun. Gunner's Mate 3rd Class Paul Henry Carr, 24 years old from Chakotah, Oklahoma, was in charge of the aft 5-inch gun mount. For the next hour, Carr and his gun crew would achieve a rate of fire that exceeded the gun's design maximum, firing over 320 rounds in sustained combat. The 5-inch shells were designed to destroy aircraft and submarines, not penetrate heavy cruiser armor. But at close range, fire with precision and determination, they could damage superstructures, destroy fire directors, and wound personnel. Chokai began taking hits. Her forward fire director was knocked out. Her bridge took several strikes that wounded her captain and killed 3 officers. Her 8-inch main battery turrets were temporarily jammed by near misses that shocked their delicate mechanisms. At 8:20 hours, Samuel B. Roberts closed to 4,000 yards and fired her 3 torpedoes at Chokai. One torpedo struck the cruiser's stern, jamming her rudder and causing her to steam in circles until her crew could regain steering control. Chokai fell out of formation, damaged and disoriented, but the cost of that torpedo hit was catastrophic for Samuel B. Roberts. At 8:23 hours, a 14-inch shell from the Battleship Congo, intended for one of the escort carriers but falling short, struck Samuel B. Roberts amidships. The massive projectile, weighing over a ton, punched completely through the destroyer escort's thin hull without detonating. It left a hole you could drive a truck through. At 8:25 hours, an 8-inch shell from Chokai struck the aft 5-inch gun mount where Paul Carr was directing fire. The shell detonated inside the mount, killing most of the crew instantly and severing Carr's right arm below the elbow. Carr, bleeding heavily and in shock, refused medical attention. The gun mount's loading mechanism had been destroyed by the hit. Carr realized that the only way to continue firing was to load shells manually, a process that required lifting 54-pound projectiles with catastrophic injuries. For the next 10 minutes, Paul Carr manually loaded and fired the aft gun while bleeding out from a severed artery. He fired 3 more rounds before collapsing. When damage control teams reached him at 8:35 hours, he was clutching an unfired shell, trying to load it into the breech despite having lost consciousness from blood loss. Lieutenant Commander Copeland reached the aft gun mount at 8:37 hours and found Carr still alive but fading rapidly. "We'll get you to sick bay," Copeland said. Carr's last words, barely audible, were, "Did we get them?" Paul Henry Carr passed away at 8:40 hours. He would be posthumously recommended for Medal of Honor, though the award would be downgraded to the Navy Cross due to administrative reasons that remain controversial to this day. At 8:45 hours, Samuel B. Roberts took 2 more direct hits from cruiser fire. Her engineering spaces flooded. Her speed dropped to 0. She was dead in the water, surrounded by Japanese warships and sinking. Lieutenant Commander Copeland gave the order to abandon ship at 8:50 hours. The crew went over the side into shark-infested waters 4,000 fathoms deep, with Japanese shells still falling around them. As Samuel B. Roberts settled by the stern, her forward 5-inch gun was still firing, manually operated by a skeleton crew who refused to leave their post until the ship went under. At 9:10 hours, USS Samuel B. Roberts sank stern first. Of her 224-man crew, 89 gave their lives. The survivors would spend the next 50 hours in the water before rescue. But in her final 70 minutes of combat, the destroyer Escort that wasn't supposed to fight surface targets had crippled a heavy cruiser, drawn fire away from the escort carriers, and proved that tonnage and armor meant nothing compared to determination and courage. While Hull and Samuel B. Roberts were making their final stands, Commander Ernest Evans aboard USS Johnston was fighting a battle that defied all logic and probability. By 8:30 hours, Johnston had been hit multiple times. 3 14-inch shells from Congo, 5 6-inch shells from cruisers, dozens of hits from destroyer fire. Her after-engine room was flooded. Her gyro compass was destroyed. Her radar was offline. She was steering manually from an emergency station aft, navigating by dead reckoning and visual observation. And she was still fighting. At 8:35 hours, Johnston engaged a heavy cruiser Tone from 7,000 yards, hitting her superstructure with 15 5-inch shells in rapid succession. Tone, one of Japan's most powerful heavy cruisers, turned away from the engagement rather than risk further damage from a destroyer that by all rights should have already sunk. At 8:45 hours, Johnston found herself between the escort, carrier Gambier Bay, and 3 Japanese cruisers closing for the destruction. Gambier Bay hit multiple times and slowing, with seconds away from being overwhelmed. Evans ordered Johnston to interpose herself between the carrier and the cruisers. The destroyer, barely making 15 knots on one engine, positioned herself in the line of fire and began engaging all 3 cruisers simultaneously with her remaining guns. For 12 minutes, Johnston traded fire with 3 ships that collectively outweighed her by a factor of 20. She took hit after hit, 6-inch and 8-inch shells tearing through her thin hull, destroying compartments, starting fires, wounding and taking the lives of crew members who had been fighting continuously for over 90 minutes. At 8:57 hours, Gambier Bay managed to turn away and increase distance from the cruisers. She would still be sunk later in the battle, but Johnston had bought her precious minutes. At 9 o'clock hours, Commander Evans was wounded by shrapnel from a near miss. He refused to leave the bridge, directing Johnston's fire from a chair because he could no longer stand. At 9:10 hours, Johnston took a direct hit to her forward magazine. The explosion destroyed her remaining operational gun mount. She was now defenseless, crippled, and sinking. At 9:20 hours, with water rising in the lower decks and no hope of survival, Evans gave the order to abandon ship. The crew went over the side. Many were already wounded. Some were too injured to swim and went down with the ship. Others made it into the water and began the long wait for rescue that might never come. At 9:45 hours, USS Johnston rolled to port and sank. Commander Ernest Evans was last seen on the bridge as the water rose around him. His body was never recovered. Of Johnston's 327-man crew, 186 survived. They would spend the next 2 days in the water before rescue ships found them. Admiral Kurita, watching from Yamato, witnessed Johnston's final moments. According to post-war accounts from Japanese officers who were present, several sailors on Yamato's deck saluted as the American destroyer went down, an unprecedented gesture of respect from an enemy who had just witnessed courage beyond measure. But the battle off Samar was far from over, and Admiral Kurita was about to make a decision that would change the course of the Pacific War. At 9:20 hours, from Admiral Kurita's perspective aboard Yamato, the battle was going extraordinarily well. His center force had sunk 2 American destroyers and 1 destroyer escort. The escort carrier Gamber Bay was in her death throes, soon to become the only U.S. aircraft carrier sunk by surface gunfire in the war. The remaining American ships were fleeing east at maximum speed, generating smoke and launching what aircraft they had left in desperate attempts to slow the Japanese advance. Kurita had overwhelming firepower still available. Yamato alone had barely been scratched. The battleships Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna were operational. He had multiple cruisers still capable of high-speed pursuit. The American force was broken and scattered. Victory was minutes away. All Kurita had to do was continue pursuit for another hour, and he would annihilate Taffy 3 completely. Then nothing would stand between his fleet and the invasion force at Leyte Gulf. At 9:25 hours, Kurita ordered his fleet to break off the pursuit and regroup. The decision shocked his subordinate commanders. Captain Tamichi Hara, commanding destroyers in the formation, would later write, "We were dumbfounded. We had them. We could see the carriers burning. We could see the destroyers sinking. All we had to do was continue firing, and we were ordered to stop. Why did Kurita withdraw from the brink of his greatest victory? The answer lies in a combination of factors that historians still debate today, but the fundamental reason was this. Kurita believed he was facing fleet carriers defended by destroyers and cruisers, not escort carriers defended by destroyers and destroyer escorts. The American carriers had been launching aircraft continuously throughout the battle, everything they had, including torpedo bombers without torpedoes and fighters armed only with machine guns. From Kurita's perspective on Yamato's bridge, watching aircraft swarm his fleet despite heavy anti-aircraft fire, he saw what looked like fleet carrier operations. The destroyers had fought like nothing in his experience. Fleet destroyers were aggressive and well-trained, but destroyer escorts, small submarine hunters, didn't charge battleships and cripple cruisers. Yet that's exactly what Samuel B. Roberts and the other small boys had done. Kurita had also received reports, later proven false, of American fleet carriers approaching from the northeast. He had been at sea for days, on a continuous air attack with minimal sleep. His flagship Takeo had been sunk by submarine 2 days earlier, and he had been fished from the water, exhausted and disoriented. Most importantly, Kurita had lost track of the larger strategic picture. He didn't know that Halsey was 300 miles north, chasing Ozawa's decoy force. He didn't know that there were no American fleet carriers anywhere near Samar. He didn't know that the ships he was fighting were the only things between him and complete victory. What he did know was that in 90 minutes of combat, he had lost 2 heavy cruisers to destroyer torpedoes. His battleships had been forced to maneuver defensively, and the American resistance had been far more fierce than intelligence had suggested. He made a decision that seemed prudent: regroup, reassess, and approach more cautiously. It was the wrong decision, but it was an understandable one for a commander who had been brilliantly deceived by Americans who made him see ghosts where there were only desperate men and dying ships. At 9:30 hours, center force turned north, away from the escort carriers and away from Leyte Gulf. Admiral Sprague, watching from Fanshawe Bay, couldn't believe what he was seeing. "God damn it," he said to his staff, "they're getting away from us." It was perhaps the greatest understatement of the Pacific War. By 11 o'clock hours, the battle was over. Kurita would make a half-hearted approach toward Leyte Gulf later in the day, but would ultimately withdraw completely, having accomplished nothing except the sinking of 1 escort carrier and 3 screening vessels. The cost had been severe for Taffy 3. USS Gamber Bay had sunk at 9:07 hours, hit by multiple 8-inch shells that set her ablaze and caused magazine explosions. USS Johnston, Hull, and Samuel B. Roberts were gone. USS Heermann had been damaged but survived. The other destroyer escorts had taken various degrees of damage. In human terms, 1,130 American sailors and aviators had given their lives. Many perished in the initial sinkings. Others spent days in the water before rescue, succumbing to wounds, exhaustion, dehydration, and shark attacks. The survivors were rescued beginning on October 26 by ships that had been frantically searching the battle area. Many men had been in the water for over 50 hours. Some were found clinging to wreckage, barely conscious. Others had formed groups in life rafts, singing to keep morale up and fighting off sharks. Seaman First Class Robert Billy, one of Johnston's survivors, described the water time in a later interview. "You'd hear a scream, and you'd know the sharks had gotten someone. Then someone else would start singing, usually something completely inappropriate like a drinking song, and we'd all join in, because if you stopped, you started thinking about how likely it was you'd be next. We sang for 2 days. The rescue operations found men who had been in the water so long that their skin was sloughing off from saltwater exposure. Others had wounds that had become infected. Several survivors would later have limbs amputated due to injuries, sustained in battle and exacerbated by time in the ocean. But they had won, against impossible odds, facing overwhelming firepower, outnumbered and outgunned by factors that made victory mathematically impossible. Taffy 3 had stopped the most powerful Japanese surface force from reaching Leyte Gulf. The strategic implications were enormous. The invasion of the Philippines continued uninterrupted. Japan's last operational battleship fleet withdrew, never again to threaten American operations. The war in the Pacific, which might have been prolonged by months or years if the Japanese had destroyed the invasion fleet, continued on its trajectory toward Japanese defeat. 3 men from the battle off Samar received the Medal of Honor. Commander Ernest E. Evans, USS Johnston, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. The citation notes that Evans challenged the enemy fire with the determination and fearlessness of a man inspired, and that his actions reflect the highest credit upon Commander Evans and the United States Naval Service. Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland, USS Samuel B. Roberts, received the Navy Cross, the Navy's second highest award, rather than a Medal of Honor, due to administrative decisions that remain controversial. Many historians believe Copeland earned the higher decoration. Lieutenant Paul Henry Carr, USS Samuel B. Roberts, was recommended for the Medal of Honor, but received the Navy Cross posthumously. His actions, continuing to load and fire his gun mount while bleeding out from a severed artery, exemplified courage under fire in its purest form. The Japanese perspective on the battle evolved significantly in the years after the war. Admiral Kurita never fully explained his decision to withdraw, beyond stating that he believed he faced a much larger force than was actually present. He passed away in 1977, carrying the controversy of his decision with him. Captain Tamichi Hara, who commanded destroyers in Center Force, wrote extensively about the battle in his post-war memoir. His assessment was blunt. The Americans fought with ferocity and determination we had never encountered. Their destroyers attacked as if they were battleships. Their escort carriers maneuvered as if they were fleet carriers. Every action they took suggested strength where there should have been weakness. By the time we realized the truth, they had already achieved their objective. They had made us afraid. Junior officers from Center Force interviewed after the war spoke with admiration bordering on disbelief about the American actions. One cruiser officer stated, "We saw a destroyer charge for battleships. We saw it survive. We saw it cripple a heavy cruiser. And we thought, if one destroyer can do this, what will 10 destroyers do? What will fleet carriers do when they arrive?" We didn't know there were no fleet carriers. The Americans made us see what wasn't there. The wreck of USS Johnston was discovered on October 31st, 2019, by the research vessel Petrel, funded by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen. The destroyer rests at a depth of 21,180 feet, over 4 miles down, making her one of the deepest shipwrecks ever located. Sonar imagery showed that her hull number, 557, was still visible on the bow. Her guns were still trained toward where the Japanese fleet had been 75 years earlier. When the discovery was announced, several survivors from Johnston's crew were still alive to hear the news. Robert Billy, 96 years old in 2019, told reporters, "She went down fighting. I'm glad they found her still pointing her guns at the enemy. That's how Commander Evans would have wanted it." The wreck of USS Samuel B. Roberts was discovered on June 22nd, 2022, by explorer Victor Vescovo. She rests at 22,916 feet, the deepest shipwreck ever located at the time of discovery. The destroyer Escort that fought like a battleship now holds the record for the deepest war shipwreck in history. Her position on the ocean floor places her nearly 2,000 feet deeper than Johnston, in the Philippine Trench where the seafloor drops to abyssal depths. Vescovo's expedition found that Samuel B. Roberts' hull had broken in two, likely from the catastrophic damage she sustained in her final minutes of combat. But her forward gun mount, Paul Henry Carr Station, was still intact, elevated toward the surface as if ready to fire one more time. USS Hull's wreck has not been definitively located as of 2024, though expeditions continue searching the battle area. She rests somewhere in the same deep water that claimed Johnston and Samuel B. Roberts, a testament to the courage of Commander Kentberger and his crew who bought time with their lives. The battle off Samar entered American naval tradition as the ultimate example of courage against impossible odds. The Navy's official history describes it as the most gallant naval action in American history and notes that no other engagement in World War II, and perhaps in all of American naval history, saw such a disparity in force met with such aggressive determination. What made the battle extraordinary wasn't just a tactical improbability, though charging battleships with destroyers certainly qualified as tactically insane, but the human decision-making under extreme pressure. Every commander at Samar knew the odds. Evans understood when he ordered Johnston to attack that he was sentencing his ship and crew to probable destruction. Kent Berger aboard Hull knew that engaging Congo was suicide. Copeland aboard Samuel B. Roberts explicitly told his executive officer they weren't coming back. Yet all of them attacked anyway, not because they thought they could win in any conventional sense, but because not attacking meant watching the escort carriers and the thousands of men aboard them be destroyed without resistance. The mathematics of the engagement told them they would lose. The calculus of honor told them they had to fight anyway. Admiral Sprague summarized the battle in his after-action report with characteristic understatement. The failure of the enemy main body and encircling light forces to completely wipe out all vessels of this task unit can be attributed to our successful smoke screen, our torpedo counterattack, continuous harassment of the enemy by bomb, torpedo, and strafing air attacks, timely maneuvers, and the definite partiality of Almighty God. The phrase definite partiality of Almighty God became legendary in Navy circles. Sprague's acknowledgement that divine intervention seemed the only rational explanation for Taffy 3's survival. But the survivors knew better. They knew it wasn't divine intervention that stopped Kurita. It was smoke screens and torpedo attacks. It was destroyers that refused to die. It was gunners who kept firing after mortal wounds. It was commanders who attacked when every tactical manual said to withdraw. It was men who decided that some things, duty, honor, protecting those who depended on you, were worth dying for, and then prove it by dying. The post-war analysis of the battle off Samar focused extensively on Kurita's decision to withdraw. Naval historians have debated for decades whether he made the right choice. Some argue that continuing the attack would have led center force into an ambush by American submarines and aircraft. Others contend that he abandoned his mission on the verge of achieving Japan's last operational victory of the war. But focusing on Kurita's decision misses the larger point. By the time he made that decision, the battle off Samar was already decided. Taffy 3 had accomplished its mission. The escort carriers had survived long enough for Kurita to doubt his information, question his assumptions, and ultimately turn away. How did 13 American ships facing 23 Japanese ships achieve that result? The answer lies in understanding what Taffy 3 actually accomplished in 2.5 hours of combat. They sank 0 Japanese ships. They inflicted relatively minor damage on several cruisers and battleships. In terms of pure destructive capability, center force was still overwhelmingly powerful when Kurita ordered the withdrawal, but they created uncertainty. And in naval warfare, uncertainty can be as powerful as 16-inch guns. Every aggressive action Taffy 3 took, the torpedo attacks, the close-range gunnery, the airstrikes, the smoke screens, reinforced Kurita's growing belief that he was facing something larger than intelligence had reported. The ferocity of the destroyer attacks suggested fleet destroyers, not screening vessels. The continuous air operations suggested fleet carriers, not escort carriers. The Americans had accidentally created a perfect deception operation, not through planning but through desperation. They had no choice but to attack aggressively because defensive operations would have meant certain destruction. That aggression made them appear stronger than they were. It was the ultimate bluff, made credible by the fact that the men doing the bluffing were willing to bet their lives on it. The legacy of the battle off Samar extends far beyond the immediate tactical results. The engagement became a case study in naval warfare, taught at the Naval War College and other military institutions worldwide. The lessons drawn from the battle inform modern naval doctrine. Superior force can be defeated by inferior force if the inferior force is willing to accept casualties that the superior force finds psychologically unacceptable. Kurita had overwhelming firepower, but he wasn't willing to risk that firepower against what he believed might be a trap. Taffy 3 had almost nothing, but they were willing to spend it all. Aggressive action creates defensive responses. Every time Johnston or Hull launched torpedoes, Japanese battleships and cruisers had to maneuver to avoid them. Those maneuvers took the Japanese ships off their optimal firing solutions and reduced their ability to concentrate fire on the carriers. The act of attacking, even with weapons that were unlikely to sink their targets, achieved defensive effects. Perception matters more than reality in the critical moments of battle. Kurita saw destroyers that fought like cruisers, saw escort carriers that operated like fleet carriers, and concluded he was facing a force that didn't exist. By the time better information might have corrected his perception, he had already made his decision. Morale and training are multiplicative, not additive. Taffy 3's ships weren't individually capable of defeating Japanese battleships, but working together, supporting each other, sacrificing themselves to protect others, they achieved effects that none could have achieved alone. The whole was genuinely greater than the sum of the parts. These lessons weren't theoretical exercises for naval officers studying the battle. They were paid for in blood by men who knew they were learning tactics that would be studied long after they were gone. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of the battle off Samar, survivors from Taffy 3 held a reunion in San Diego. Fewer than 40 men attended. Age and wounds had taken their toll over 5 decades. They gathered aboard the aircraft carrier USS Midway, their museum ship, for a ceremony honoring their fallen comrades. Robert Billy, by then 71 years old and one of the youngest survivors present, spoke briefly. "We did what we had to do. That's all. Commander Evans gave us an order, and we followed it. If we had to do it again, knowing what we know now, we'd do the same thing. Because those carriers were counting on us. The men on those carriers were counting on us. And you don't let your shipmates down, even if it costs you everything." The survivors then scattered ashes and flowers over the side of the ship into San Diego Harbor in memory of the 1,130 men who never came home. Among those remembered was Commander Ernest Edwin Evans, who charged battleships in a destroyer because it was the right thing to do. Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland, who led a destroyer escort into combat she couldn't win because someone had to. Paul Henry Carr, who loaded shells with a severed arm because 3 more rounds might make the difference. Commander Leon Kintberger, who kept whole fighting until the ocean claimed her. And the hundreds of others, gunners, engineers, damage control specialists, radio men, cooks, and deckhands, who stood their posts when every instinct said a run. The battle off Samar proved something that military theorists had long debated, that courage, properly applied, can defeat material superiority. Not always, and not easily, but sometimes courage is enough to turn mathematical certainty into tactical confusion, and tactical confusion into strategic victory. The 13 ships of Taffy, 3 weren't supposed to win. The laws of physics, the principles of naval warfare, and simple arithmetic all said they would lose. They should have been annihilated in minutes, leaving nothing but wreckage and bodies drifting in the Philippine Sea. Instead, they bought 2.5 hours. They inflicted enough damage to make Kurita cautious. They created enough uncertainty to make him doubt. They fought with enough ferocity to make him believe he was fighting something much more dangerous than escort carriers and tin cans. And when the smoke cleared and the guns fell silent, the escort carriers, the primary targets, the ships that absolutely had to survive, were steaming away to the east, damaged but alive. Mission accomplished. At what cost? Everything they had. The final words belong to Admiral Clifton Sprague, who submitted his after-action report on October 29, 1944, for days after the battle. In the section marked Recommendations, he wrote, "It is recommended that the officers and men of the screening vessels of Task Unit April 3rd, 77 be given special recognition for their actions on October 25, 1944. Their conduct in engaging an overwhelmingly superior force was in the highest traditions of the United States Navy. They knew they were going into harm's way. They knew survival was unlikely. They attacked anyway, and by doing so, saved this task unit from destruction. No commander could ask for more from his ships or his men. The Navy has no higher tradition than this." The destroyers and destroyer escorts of Taffy 3 had proven that tonnage, armor, and firepower weren't the only measures of a warship's capability. That courage, determination, and the absolute refusal to quit counted for something in the mathematics of battle. That sometimes the small boys could beat the giants. The battle off Samar ended on October 25, 1944, at approximately 9:30 hours, when Admiral Kurita ordered Center Force to withdraw. But the legend of Taffy 3, the escort carriers that ran, the tin cans that charged, and the men who made the impossible real, would echo through naval history forever. In the deepest waters of the Philippine Sea, for miles down where sunlight never reaches and pressure would crush a human instantly, 3 American warships rest in the darkness. Their guns still point toward the enemy they faced. Their hulls still bear the scars of the hits they took. Their crews still rest aboard, having made the ultimate sacrifice far from home. But they accomplished their mission. The carriers they protected survived. The invasion they supported succeeded. The war they fought was won. And 79 years later, when naval officers studied the Battle off Samar, they learned the same lesson that Admiral Kurita learned too late. That it's not the size of the ships in the fight that matters, but the size of the fight in the ships. The tin cans charged the battleships. The battleships blinked first, and the day belonged to Taffy 3.